go ahead and turn things over now to Hannah. Thank you for being here, Hannah.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Like Emery said, my name is Hannah Pope. I'm the Emerging Technologies Librarian, and so I do a lot of random things with various technologies, and so I'm the head of the maker space, and we do a lot with 3D printing and electronics, but I also have a big interest in data visualization, and so I'm trying to get more of a data viz program started at the library, and so kind of the purpose of this webinar is going to be both kind of an introduction to what data visualization is and what are some of the things that you can do with it are, but also kind of to gauge interest on what faculty like you are interested in and what you would want help from the library with. So let's kind of get started. So what is data visualization? Well, kind of the simplistic version is it's taking data of any type, qualitative, quantitative, doesn't matter, and transferring it into a visual format that lets the viewer kind of get the main idea just from a glance. So it's supposed to take a lot of big data and make it very easily transferable, and a lot of it also kind of puts it in layman's terms, I guess. So here are a couple of examples of where people have taken large data sets and they've made them into a variety of graphs and infographics and things like that. And we'll look at a bunch of different examples of what those can be. So different types of data visualization, these are kind of the most well-known types, I guess. Obviously graphs, we've been using these forever and ever and ever. Infographics, they keep getting more sophisticated and really cool over the last few years, and people really love infographics. Geographic representation, so that's things like GIS stuff, a lot of spatial data that's very popular, and you can kind of use it in a variety of ways. And then exhibits, so basically taking this data and creating an exhibit, something sort of akin to what you would find in like a museum, in order to both share data but also kind of educate and create an interactive kind of fun experience for people who don't want to look at a spreadsheet. And then a lot of these can be interactive, so we'll look at a couple of examples. So the first one is graphs. These are basic graphs. I know all of you have seen these graphs before. I did a class a while ago on information visualization, and you would be surprised at how often people choose the wrong types of graphs for certain pieces of information. But basically this is an infographic version of what different graphs are. And then there's tons of best practices out there. I use this bar graph example as what you should do when you're creating a visualization. So this bar graph one has something about using horizontal labels and ordering the data in a way that's pleasing to the eye and things like that, because a lot of data visualization is not just taking the data out, it's also arranging it in a way that's both pleasing to the person who's viewing it, so you want it to look good aesthetically, but you also want to make it clear and concise so that people can look at what you're doing and kind of get the gist of what the data that you're trying to get across without having to think too hard about it. So anyway, I kind of used both the example of all the different graphs that are available, as well as going into a bar chart and what you would do for best practices for that. The next type is infographics. I found a bunch of infographics online. They're all very cool. If you just kind of Google when you get a chance infographics and then kind of choose a topic, you'll find an infographic for everything. But I kind of wanted to show this example because it shows so many different types of infographics. You can kind of see how there's a combination of graphs. There's the pictures that are kind of using like the human figures in order to kind of get across the concept of how many people are doing a certain thing. You have all of the different symbols and things, but it's very interesting to look at. You'll also notice that they're sticking to a certain color scheme because that's something that you want to think about with data visualization, is not overwhelming people with too many colors. Typically you want to keep it under 5, and that's because it keeps your information concise, and it also looks pretty good across the board. So you can kind of see how they have the same color scheme running through all these graphics. They have a similar tone, similar fonts, that sort of thing, but it's still really interesting to look at. So basically, if you're interested in creating something like an infographic, these are something that's out there and available. The next one is the geospatial kind of thing that we talked about a little bit earlier. So looking at geographic information and then representing that visually. So the one on the top was done probably with Tableau, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But basically, it's where you can either take, a general map of anywhere. It can look realistic. It can be sort of like the one on the top where it's just sort of, I think this is by county. Or it can be like the one on the bottom where it actually looks like it was grabbed from Google Earth and then data was put on top of it. The really cool thing about using geographic kind of data is that you can use it in a way you can interpret it in a lot of different ways. So you can see it, the one on the top, you can't really see the scale here, but it goes from the deep orange to the kind of deep teal color, and that's to indicate, I'm pretty sure it's income by county. And so it's kind of a cool way to bring color, but also see the different changes between income at just a glance kind of level. So you can see how some states have really high income right off the bat, and you can see how some are, completely teal and have really low income, like that kind of thing. So it basically gets a lot of information across really quickly, but you also don't have any of the landmarks and things that you see on the bottom picture. So the bottom, they took a satellite picture and then they kind of added natural landmarks and things on top of it. So they kind of added in the river, they added in different areas, I want to say like near, it looks like sort of levees and things. I could be wrong about that, but they've kind of added the most important parts of this from a kind of natural point of view. So even though you see all of the kind of urban sprawl or whatever, they wanted to emphasize the river portion and whatever. And so you can do things like this where you kind of take what it actually looks like, but you enhance it in some way. They also used a 3D technique for this, which is kind of cool. And I'll talk about interactivity in a little bit, but you can basically like bring that in and, just add in various things. And it can end up being really cool and very interesting for both you to present and also for students to look at and use. You can also do exhibits. A lot of libraries are doing this. A lot of places have data-driven exhibits these days. So one of these, you kind of see how this person's interacting with the wall. And I don't know exactly what the data set is, but it looks to be something that has a combination of like a geospatial element, but also you can kind of narrow it down using that knob to kind of get, whatever they have their different categories. You can see the different color categories. But that's obviously an interactive exhibit. You're looking at a big data set that's been condensed into an interactive map sort of thing, and then you're able to use those things on the wall to interact with the exhibit and kind of, see the information that you really want. I think things like that are really cool, and I'll be talking a little bit later about a data visualization lab. But basically, if you have a really interesting piece of research that you want to share and you think it would be great done in a visual way, then setting it up like an exhibit is something that's worth looking into. We also have on the side, you can't really, it's a terrible quality picture, and I apologize for that, but that's actually the Bayeux Tapestry. So I know many of you are probably familiar with it, but if you aren't, it is a large historical tapestry that depicts the conquering of England by William I. And it's very popular. It's commonly used as a historical document where people cite it for various things. It's considered fairly accurate. It's housed in Bayeux, France, but someone used a visualization lab to actually blow it up to make it real sized, and then they put it around this area so that these students could actually go in with their history class and look at it and be able to see it the size that it was intended to be, even though they couldn't obviously travel to France. And so while that might not seem straight off like data visualization, it is, because it's a way to kind of represent something that obviously you can't technically get to, but represent it in a way that people can see it and get that information that they need, as opposed to looking at like screenshots or something online. So it's kind of a different interpretation of that. Kind of along those lines, other exhibits that I've seen that I don't have a picture of, there was one where they have recreated a speech that was in kind of this square in London, and what they did was they had someone record the speech, they had someone recreate what the square would have looked like in the 1800s or 1600s whenever that speech was being given. They added in background noises that were true to the time. They added in pop-up facts and things about it. So that was a form of data visualization that was more of an immersive experience, but it was very cool because it was done as an exhibit and people could go in and, you know, even though they're not reading, you know, this text of this speech, they're hearing it and they're basically experiencing it. So while it's not, again, it's not a traditional interpretation of what data visualization can be, it's still really cool, and the potential is there for a lot of additional kind of things like that. Especially if you partner with somebody like Special Collections here at the library. Obviously, we have a very massive Appalachian collection that includes recordings and, you know, like all sorts of things. And so it would be one of those things where you could, if you were doing, you know, research on something to do with Appalachia, then you could create an exhibit and kind of bring in all these different things, which would be really cool. And then the final picture on the bottom is a giant exhibit done by IBM. I'm pretty sure that is the island of Manhattan. But basically, you can go and interact with it. It's like a big Think exhibit. It's outdoors, which is really cool. It's got that panel on the side that has a lot more information. But it's just a very interesting representation. And again, I know we don't have the big budget to do a giant LED wall, but it's just kind of cool to see what's out there. And then finally, you can do all sorts of interactions. So interactive data is really cool. You can add movement. You can kind of change different things that you're looking at. You can have pop-up information about things that you find important. I actually have a couple of examples which I think are really cool. So we're going to look at these right quick, not spend a whole lot of time on it. But this is an example of an interactive infographic, which I think is really awesome. And it's all about where coffee comes from. And so you can see how someone has basically created this, and they go through and they've basically made all of these different things to kind of show the full range of where coffee goes, that sort of thing. Very cool. And again, it's very infographic centered, and a lot of these images you can just grab, because I'll talk about in a little bit some programs that you can get started with. But basically, you can grab different images and put them all together in an infographic fairly easily, even if you don't have any sort of design background. That's not super necessary. So that's one. Here's another example. I'm a fan of rock music, and so I love this visualization. I think it's awesome. Plus, if you notice at the top, there's a little Appalachian folk thing, but basically you go through all these different types of music, and you can actually click on each of these, and there's a little sample of that type of music, which I think is really cool. So you can see how it shows all the different interactions that these things have. You can see how they have different colors for different subgenres and all that sort of stuff. So, and it also has the timeline on the side. Again, I really like this. You could click on it. That's kind of the Appalachian folk, which is appropriate for us. But basically, you can see how it's got all of the different connections here, and they've kind of visualized it this way, so you can see where it ends up, which is really cool. So that's another example. And then the final one is more of a traditional interactive experience. So you can click on this and get more information. This is all about global economic relationships. So this is, I clicked on the one that was China to the United States, and you can clearly see that it's a thick line, which means that it's more, that we export more there than, I mean, they export more to us than, say, you know, this thin line from Japan to the United States. So you can see this visualization. It's pretty obvious without even having to really think about it that the thicker line means more, you know, more of something. In this case, it's more money, more exports. But you can also, you know, like I said, click on it. You can hover over certain things and it highlights certain things. You know, it's just, there's a lot of different types of interactivity out there, and I think it's really interesting. And so even though these are more advanced visualizations, and I know we can't do this like right off the bat, it's just cool to kind of see the potential and for what's out there, which is why I like to kind of show it. All right, let's get back into this. So what can you do with the library? Basically, I am going to be hopefully starting a more comprehensive data visualization service. So people will be able to come in, like faculty, you can come in and talk to me about a variety of things. I'll be hopefully teaching faculty and students different types of software. So if there's a certain, you know, data viz software, say like Tableau, that you're interested in, then we'll have workshops on that. We can also work with the library to both find and create resources for research. So if your research deals with big data sets and you would like to represent that visually, we can both help you find those you know, resources the traditional way, like the articles and all that kind of stuff. But we also will hopefully be able to help you create these great visualizations to supplement your research. And also it's going to be great for if you want to present at conferences and you want to present it in a really interesting visual way, poster sessions, that sort of thing. We'll be able to help out with that. We'll also be able to help create projects that kind of incorporate data viz more into your actual courses itself. So if you're a faculty member and you're interested in getting your students to do more data visualization as opposed to doing kind of a more traditional research gathering, that sort of thing, these types of projects can make really great products, and it's a good way for its students to get those extra skills that are not just, you know, written. I mean, I know, you know, verbal and written skills are really important, but I think it's also really cool and very helpful to students to be able to work with different types of software and understand how to deal with data and how to present it in a really interesting and beautiful way that makes people interested in it. And again, that kind of also ties back into the exhibit space. So hopefully we'll be able to create a data viz lab in the future in the library within the next few years. Data visualization labs are really great because not only can you use it to create data, but you can also display it on basically their rooms where they have lots of blank walls and projectors and ways to be interactive with data. So you can bring your students to the library, you can kind of show them visualizations that are larger, you can work in like a larger class environment. So similar to what we saw with the Bayeux Tapestry, you can use that sort of mindset in the data viz lab. In addition to that, it'll also be a really great exhibit space. So if you want to show off your research and you want to kind of have people come in and see what you've been doing, it'll be a place where people can actually come in and do that, interact, and so it'll hopefully be kind of a teaching and learning space and an exhibit space all kind of wrapped into one. But basically, yeah, the library is just hoping to expand what we currently offer. We don't have a whole lot of data visualization stuff right now, but again, I'm really wanting to both add in the software and add in working with faculty to, you know, kind of make their visualizations come to life. So if you have an idea, we should be able to come up with something that will work. So let's talk a little bit about available software that we have, and basically I have a bunch of different types of software that I'm going to talk about. Most of these are fairly intuitive. They're pretty easy to start with. So if you've never done any visualization before and you just want to get started, there's a lot of great things out there. So Tableau, I've talked about this or mentioned it a lot previously in the presentation, and we'll talk a little bit more about what Tableau is and what you can do with it. Same with Gephi. Pictochart is more of an information or infographic thing. Tiki-Taki is this really cool thing I found. It sounds really silly, but it's actually pretty amazing. Story Maps, and then Adobe Creative Cloud. I'm not going to go into much detail about Adobe Creative Cloud simply because I know most of you are very familiar with it. But if you're interested in doing things like interactivity or animation or infographics that are custom made, you can use the Adobe Creative Cloud for that. Programs like Illustrator are what I created my kind of first infographics on, but again, I'd say the Adobe Creative Cloud, even though we're all kind of aware of what it does have more of a learning curve than most of the other programs I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about it, but do know that that is an option. And since we have a partnership with Adobe to where faculty can actually download all of the Creative Cloud onto their machines via our kind of shibboleth thing. It goes through and we get all this stuff for free, which is awesome. But again, there is a bit of a learning curve. So I'm going to start with Tableau. Basically, Tableau is this really great program. I really love it. I've used it a lot. You can do a bunch of different types of visualizations with it, and what makes it really cool is that you can actually upload giant data sets into Tableau and then use the different variables. You can choose variables, you can choose graph types. I kind of chose this screenshot because it shows a bunch of different types of graphing options that are available. You can see all the different types here. You can see things over time, you can see bar charts, you can see the nice geographic element up in the sales by city part. But basically Tableau is kind of, I don't want to say it's like a one-stop shop, but I do think that it gets a lot of great stuff done in a fairly, I guess, visually pleasing way. Something to think about with Tableau is, as faculty members, it is a service that you have to pay for. It's software you have to pay for. But as faculty members, we get an education kind of free license for a year. So all you have to do is email them. I did this a few months ago. All you do is you email them, and then you send them your kind of profile for the university, like a link to where it says, oh, I'm a professor or whatever. And they'll send you the activation key, and you can get the entire full desktop version for free. There's also options where if you wanted to teach this in an entire class, there's an education kind of way that you can get access for all of your students at once, which is actually kind of how I originally had access to it years and years ago. But it's a really great program. Like I said, it takes in, you can upload just an entire data set. It does take a while to kind of tinker around with it and like see where moving variables will make certain things happen with your graphs and things like that. But what makes it really cool is that you have all of these different types of graphs, and while you can't really see it using a picture, if I had the real Tableau up here, you can actually scroll over all of these different graphs, and it has an element of interactivity to it. They have little pop-ups with more information about what each of these things are. You can actually create, like this picture that I'm showing you is it's got the 9 different kind of charts on it right here. And you can create different charts and different, it's on a, they call it a dashboard basically, but you can create those individual charts and then compile them on to a dashboard, and then you can actually put this information onto a website. And so it can funnel from Tableau onto a website, and so people can interact with it there. A lot of people do that for you know, showing off statistics. I know some libraries use it as a way to show, you know, how many visits they've had every year and whatever. So you can use it for a bunch of statistical purposes besides just kind of to show data from your specific research or your specific project. But again, it's really cool. It's got a lot of great features to it. This is one of the programs that I am hoping to do a workshop series with, because it's there are a lot of great things you can do with it, and it can be intimidating for anyone who's never used it before. But it's definitely worth looking into, and since we have that great education discount, like the free software for it, it's definitely worth pursuing. So this is a good kind of alternative to some other more pricey like data options. And so anyway, that's Tableau, and again, I will hopefully be teaching some classes on this in the fall. The next one is Gephi. So Gephi, I like to include it because it's free and it's open source. But what Gephi typically is used for is it shows connections between different pieces of data. So actually, when you download the program, which again is free and open source, so if you want to download it just to see what it looks like, when you download the program, it comes preloaded with a data set from Les Mis, the book Les Miserables, and basically it has where you can play around with that data set and you can see how different characters interact, and it's indicative by color and by, you know, kind of thickness of the line, but you can also, you know, change it to emphasize certain pieces of the data and that sort of thing. It does kind of stick with this weird kind of web-looking thing, but it actually is pretty cool, and you can add a bunch of different types of data viz with it. Again, I like to include it because it's open source, but you might find limitations for what you can actually do with Gephi. But if you're interested in looking at it, I would suggest just downloading it for fun and kind of playing around with the Les Mis data set, because it's interesting. Also, there are 1 billion people in that novel. It's crazy. I mean, I know it's like super thick, but anyway, you'll see if you play with it that there's just like, it's a large data set. You wouldn't think for something like that it would be large, but it really is. The next one is PictoChart. So I mentioned earlier that there are places where you can make infographics even if you have no artistic ability, and PictoChart is where it's at. So PictoChart is a web-based kind of software. You just go on, you create a free account. If you want to do a paid version, you get a couple of extra kind of things, but for the most part, the free version is really good. But it's awesome because they have all of these like symbols and pictures and things that they have pre-created for you, and you basically just take your data that you have and you figure out what you want to emphasize, and then you're able to choose fonts and you can choose symbols, like I said, and you can just kind of drag and drop it everywhere and make these long kind of infographics. And you can see in this example that especially the second one is kind of obvious that it has different chunks. And that's because you can take different boxes and kind of emphasize certain parts to build a complete infographic. This program is very easy to learn. I learned it very, very quickly. It really is just mostly drag and drop. How you want to represent your data is really up to you. So you can choose, the picture that's going to illustrate your data the best. You would have to like manually type in like the, 75% of this, blah, blah, blah. But it does most of the work for you. You can figure out color schemes and things. And it's worth looking at and just playing around with. Again, it's free. If you're interested in creating infographics, this is a great program to start with. It's way easier to use than, say, Adobe Illustrator, because Adobe Illustrator, you're going to be creating everything from scratch, which can be very intimidating if you if you don't have a lot of design background or whatever. But this really does just cut down on most of it, and you can get a really interesting, professional-looking infographic in a very short amount of time with not a whole lot of effort. This one is called Tiki Talkie. Again, it sounds really silly, but it's really, really cool. I came across this because I was trying to find interesting ways to represent data, and this was a timeline-based web browser kind of program. The example that I have up here is the history of the Tower of London. You can see how at the bottom they have a timeline, which is really cool. As you scroll across that bar across, you actually can move up on the timeline, and so you can see how they have these pictures, and you have it says like Henry the Fourth or whatever. If you click on that, then it has information. It kind of flips around and has information, and so it's a really good way to represent temporal data. So if you work with something that requires a timeline, it's just a really interesting way to do this. And something that's really great about Tiki Talkie is hopefully in the library, I want to get an entire class license for it, because if you get the class license, then if you're working on this in different groups, your class is working on it in different groups, you can actually edit the timeline at the same time. And so it's very group oriented, which is very cool. It also has, this is the 3D version of it, which I think is visually very interesting. But you can see in the corner that it says 2D. If you click that, then it actually goes and has timelines that kind of run across the screen, and you can scroll that way instead of having this sort of pop-up thing that's happening. But you can also see how you can categorize different parts of the data. So it's categorized as architecture and works, events, and reigns. So obviously the part with Henry IV is the reign, so that goes by, you know, kings that were and like that's where their life is, and then the center is events, so Tower Breach, and then the other one was basically talking about how, you know, this tower part was built, that kind of thing. So you can have your students divide the data into interesting groups. You can have them work together. You can have them add in different information, and then when you actually get the final thing, it's interactive and people can scroll through it, and it just looks really cool. So again, this would be something that would be very interesting if you had it set up as an exhibit for a little while in like the data visualization lab, something like that. So I know a lot of you have probably heard of ArcGIS. ArcGIS is a very comprehensive, very detailed program that deals with geographic information systems data. We do not, it's very expensive, and the library does not currently have any licenses for it. I know there are places around campus that do, so especially, you know, geography and stuff like that. But they have a couple of programs that are web-based online that are actually more of kind of a storytelling sort of thing. It's through ArcGIS. It's by the same company. It kind of uses some of their geographic data, but it also is free, and this would be a really great program to use with students, because if you are talking about say you're talking about like a historical time period or something, and it's centered around a very specific space, and you have information about different parts of that town or something like that. This is kind of an example that could be used for that. So this particular one has stuff about Palm Springs, but basically they have created little flags on the actual I guess what topography would that be? A topographical map, whatever. So they've kind of placed flags all around Palm Springs, and you can click on those flags, and it actually takes you to the various places where they have pictures of those places and then information about them. And they call it story maps, but there are tons of different types of story maps. You can actually go and look at a bunch of different examples of them. They're very cool. It's a really great way to incorporate important information, but also to present it in a way that's kind of fun to click through. Again, it's another interactive thing. It's web-based, and it would be a really good option for students to use. So if you were interested in assigning a group kind of task, this would be a really cool way to get them to, present the relevant information, but present it in a pleasing way that has lots of pictures and is kind of fun. Again, this is just one example, but there are a variety of different ways you can do this. And if you're interested in story maps, I would definitely suggest going and checking them out because they're very cool. And so that was just kind of a brief overview of a bunch of different options that you have. Again, this webinar was mostly to let you know what's out there, at least a little bit what's out there, and also for you to let me know what you're interested in learning more about, because that'll help me kind of shape the future of the program and how we want to do data services at the library. So I guess now we'll do chat stuff.
Yeah, I think I collected a couple of different questions.
Okay, great.
Okay. One of the first ones that Beverly asked, and I think you may have answered it some, but I wanted to give you a chance to maybe reiterate any key points.
Sure.
Kind of looking for, beyond the big picture, what are some ways to start small and try something for now as a beginner?
So I think it depends on what type of data that you're working with and what you're hoping to get out of it. So if you were wanting to represent something in like an infographic format, then I would definitely suggest using PictoChart, just because it is really simple and you can kind of get an idea of what different types of data are or different visualizations are out there, and you can just kind of drag and drop and experiment. If you wanted to get started with something more geospatial related, Tableau is really good for that because it doesn't have a very sophisticated GIS portion, but it's enough to where you can kind of get the idea of what a GIS element would be without having to go into ArcGIS and like freak out. So it really just depends, I think, on what type of data you're wanting to represent. But I'm happy to work on a case-by-case basis, obviously, to kind of see what the best fit would be. Most of the things that I talked about are very much entry-level. I know they kind of looked a little complicated, but I promise they're actually really intuitive and they're very easy to learn. And I mean, you obviously have to do a little bit of tinkering, but for the most part, I try to choose more simple programs to start.
Excellent, thank you. And as a follow-up for that, Beverly later sort of asked if you think it's easy enough for students to use on their own story maps, if you feel like...
Oh, yes, definitely. It's very, very simple. Like I said, it's web-based. It's, again, very much like upload a picture here, add in the information there, click where you want this to be, like that sort of thing. So it's very, very simple, and it would just be, like I said, a fun kind of, if you wanted to do it as a group project or something, it wouldn't require a lot of extra kind of hand-holding or specialized instruction, anything like
Excellent. Earlier, Alana asked what she thought that maybe some data visualizations could be a little misleading, and if you had recommendations about which would be least misleading.
I mean, that is true. It's very true, but I feel like that's also true for most things. It's hard to say because it really is up to what the person who creates it is trying to get across. So obviously, if they have this, bizarre outlier that they don't want to talk about, they might not include it in their final infographic or something like that. I would say infographics are probably the visualization that has the most flexibility, meaning if you wanted to omit things, then you could easily do that because you're creating something that's flat. It's not always interactive. Also, you are picking and choosing which kind of information you want to focus on for that. Whereas if you were doing something in Tableau and you uploaded this entire data set, unless you went through and scrubbed out, certain outliers, those will still appear when you're creating like your bar charts and stuff. So it really is up to the person who creates the visualization. So, I mean, I feel like cherry picking happens all the time in all situations. So it's really hard to kind of say definitively which visualizations are best or most authentic. It really depends on the source. And I think that's kind of that's also, I'm going to do a quick library plug here. It's important to know the source of your information. We're living in this, horrible era of fake news or whatever. So that definitely applies to visualization. So something that the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times has great visualizations if you haven't been on their website and seen them. But New York Times visualizations are typically going to be more accurate and more, realistic than, say, something that came off of like BuzzFeed. So, look at the source. Yeah.
I completely agree. And normally what I do is I have my students just use Excel, because if I don't, then they tend to go to places like Tableau or Pictograph or whatever. And then when they do that, they create these graphs and these data visualizations that end up being a little misleading. And so I just wondered if you had a suggestion when it came to those specific ones online. So yeah, that was all.
Yeah, if you have it in an Excel kind of what you could,
but they're not misleading, or you can make them not misleading. So.
Right. So if you're giving them the Excel spreadsheet, then what you can do is lock it and like force them to not have editing privileges and then upload it into Tableau, because then they're stuck with it basically. The information is there. So that would be the only way I could see potentially kind of monitoring, but I don't know. That's a tricky question, but a very important one. So I don't know. I'll have to think a little bit more on it.
So Hannah, we have your contact information up, and there's the email I also put in the chat. But it was also asked if you're going to be around this summer when there's more time to try out new stuff.
Yes, I am. So again, I'm hoping to start stuff like do an actual formal workshop series in the fall. So if you're interested in incorporating things into your curriculum for the fall semester or anything else, yes, 12-month employees, woo! So if you're interested in doing that, I will be here over the summer, and that's like the perfect time to kind of get all of that together. So definitely.
I'll also be sharing with Hannah the all of your names and contact information signed up for the workshop. So she'll have your information. Maybe reach out and make some connections if you're interested in exploring this further in the fall, for sure.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.